The sons of Sung have joined together, and together we will sit around, run experiments, and do nothing. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Descent Part 1 and 2, which are Episode 26 of Season 6 and Episode 1 of Season 7 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the two-part episode Descent. So Descent is the episodes in which the Enterprise encounter the Borg. However, they are acting strangely. They are acting as individuals and with emotion, and they realize that the only other Borg individual that they encountered was Hugh, the Borg drone that they learned how to be an individual and then returned to the collective, and so they figured that this is their fault, and now these Borg are more violent and going around killing members of the Federation. So the Enterprise gets assigned a task force meant to seek out and protect from the Borg. However, during this time, Data started feeling emotions. He started feeling anger, and one of the Borg beams on the ship and entices Data with emotions, and eventually Data runs off with this Borg, and so the Enterprise chases after them, follows them to the planet, and beams down the majority of the crew to search for Data. And then Picard, Geordi, Troy, and a doomed red shirt, or yellow shirt in this case, find the structure with the Borg. And after the yellow shirt is killed, it's revealed that Lore is in fact in charge of these new Borg, and that Lore has enticed Data with these dark emotions to become evil and join his side, and they vow to destroy the Federation. And then they just hang out on the planet, and Lore does these wacky experiments to Geordi, threatening his life, and Crusher takes control of the Enterprise and then destroys the Borg ship by using some trickery with these metaphasic shields that let her go to the sun. And then Riker and Worf encounter Hugh, and the Hugh gives Riker and Worf a way to sneak inside the compound to rescue the crew members. Meanwhile, Lore has realized that Data is going to betray him, so asks him to kill Picard. He refuses to do so, so then they're going to kill Data, but then Hugh intervenes, and then Riker and Worf show up and start killing people at random, and that creates chaos. And in the chaos, Data manages to finally kill Lore, and everything is resolved, and it's implied that Hugh will now be in charge of these rogue Borg. Anyway, so Descent. What do I think about these episodes? Well, I think that they're decent. Descent, get it? Sorry, I had to go there. I remember, the funny thing is that I remember reading in a TV guide, because the TV guide used to love to write articles about Star Trek, and I remember reading about this part 1 before it came out, because of course I was very excited. Oh, what's the big finale gonna be of season 6? Season 6 has been such an amazing season. What have they got in store for us? And they said that the Borg would be back and they would be showing emotions, and I was like, wow. And then they also said that Lore would be in charge of the Borg. Yeah, so the TV guide, a week or two before this episode came out, told us the fucking ending of part 1 that was supposed to be a surprise. God damn it. These people did not. People talk about spoilers and how all these, spoilers are given away, but in modern times, the studio, at least, and people involved with the project, make a much more asserted effort to keep spoilers under wraps. It's the more I'm going through these 90s stuff, they didn't really care. They just gave away the freaking ending. And so when I was watching the episode, the whole time I was waiting for freaking Lore to show. I'm like, why isn't they mentioning Lore? When's Lore gonna show up? And then finally at the very last scene, they're like, oh, Lore. I'm like, of course it's Lore, because I read a fucking TV guide over a week ago. But anyway, and then there was part 2, which was just a mess. I remember I wanted to like it so badly. I was like, now this has got to be a good episode. I'm just maybe thinking about it wrong. Maybe I'm not. But I had this sinking feeling that I couldn't ignore, that voice in the back of my head being like, no, Mark, it sucks. But I didn't want it to suck. I wanted it to be really good, but no, it did suck. It was a massive disappointment. Now, so this makes it very similar to Time Zero in the regards that it's a two-parter that ends one season and then begins another, where part 1 is actually really ominous and creepy and quite good, and part 2 is a gigantic letdown, disappointment, and quite a terrible episode. So I always think these two-parters are really similar in that regard. In fact, up to this point, the 4 two-parters that we've gotten in the show most recently, consecutive two-parters, out of 4 of them, 3 of them had a really good first part and a really, really terrible, disappointing second part. Time Zero, Birthright, and then now this episode, Descent. The exception, of course, that's in between Time Zero and Birthright is Chain of Command, which is actually, both parts are really good, and one of the rare examples where part 2 is actually better than part 1. I can't think there's any other TNG two-parter that was like that. Well, Gambit I'm about to cover, it's hard to say because both parts are kind of equal in my opinion, and both are fine. Whereas, yeah, I think Chain of Command is the only one in part 2 is better than part 1. But, yeah, but it's different than Best of Both Worlds and Redemptions. We're both good, and both parts were good. It's just part 1 was slightly better than part 2. Whereas in the case of Time Zero, Birthright, and this, part 2 is a mitigated disaster that completely ruins it. So, before I jump into any of the big major stuff, I gotta talk about the opening scene of Descent Part 1 with Stephen Hawkins. Now, I always have to admit funny, ignorant things about myself, but I'd never heard of Stephen Hawkins. This is how I've heard of Stephen Hawkins, because I remember, again, the good old TV guide where it had an article about, oh my god, Stephen Hawkins is going to be an episode of Star Trek Next Generation, and he's playing himself. And I was like, oh my god, that's amazing. Who's Stephen Hawkins? But of course I've heard of him after this, and then whenever I heard him mention for the longest time, I'm like, oh yeah, that's that dude who was in Descent. But of course, I was aware that because the article told me that he was a very noted, celebrated scientist. And also, you gather that from the context of the episode. Duh. I mean, Data chose him along with Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein as, scientific figures in Earth's history to play poker with. So obviously. And apparently this is the only time in the Star Trek franchise that a actor played themselves on screen. Yeah, that's probably true. I can't think of any modern Trek examples where someone would play themselves. So a lot of people love this scene. In fact, I talked about this top 25 or something TV guide did once, and they put schisms on it just because of that one scene about Data's poem. Well, they also had this episode on here, and this is before part 2 came out because it was in between season 6 and 7. And the only reason it was on there because of the opening poker scene, obviously, with Stephen Hawkins. Now, I think it was an interesting scene, but even though I didn't know who Stephen Hawkins was, I did know that he was a real-life scientist, and so it's hard for me to see this scene as anything other than an excuse to have Stephen Hawkins in the show. And apparently the whole concept came about when he was doing a documentary on, I believe, on one of his books, Brief History in Time, I believe, at Paramount. And so he was a huge Star Trek fan, so asked for a tour of the Next Generation sets, and he was given a tour, and he even asked to sit in the captain's chair and how much he loved it, and everyone was taking photographs with them and everything, and he said, I want to be on the show. Could you write me in the show? And so they're like, well, absolutely. So the writers tried to figure out, well, how the hell what are we gonna do to have Stephen Hawkins in the show? And then they realized, hey, let's do a poker game where Data decides to play poker with a lot of historical scientists. And so basically it could have gone in any episode. Now, I guess like the main connecting theme that this has to the rest of the episode is that it's about Data exploring humanity, but that's like vague. Like that could have been anything. Like they really could have put this in any episode. I think they purposely put it in the season finale because they wanted to make it more grand. Oh, it was a big deal, but really it was just a one and done. You're out of there. It didn't really have anything to do with anything. So it was nice and lovely and everything, but I wouldn't say it's, put it in my top 25 just because of that one scene. Sorry. I think that's ridiculous. But anyway. So, getting into the main storyline of the episodes, the Borg. So, they weren't unsure of whether or not they wanted to do the Borg. In fact, apparently, one of the ideas they had for doing the season 6 finale was a story idea they were calling All Good Things, an episode title they would obviously recycle for later on. But in that case, the crew were ordered back to Earth, where all the various officers were reassigned to different assignments. Now, they didn't say, but I'm assuming, since this is an episodic TNG, that in part 2 they would find a way to get them all back together. So yeah, that seem like it would be a waste of time. Unless you're going to keep them separate, which I'm sure they weren't, then don't waste our time with the storyline like that. But then the other storyline that they were banning about is having Data's dreams turning to nightmares, an idea that they obviously did eventually do in season 7 with the episode Phantasms, which I love that episode. I think it's very underrated, but it would not make a good cliffhanger season finale. I would say that. So then Jerry Taylor came up with an idea to have them encounter these, big, powerful aliens that were a threat, and maybe have a crossover with DS9. It's funny because I just talked about in DS9, their season finale, they wanted to have a crossover with TNG originally, and apparently TNG wanted to have a crossover with DS9. But anyway, they would encounter these aliens that were a threat, and Data would start to feel emotions, and he would start to become darker, and they would struggle with that. And then it would turn out that Lore was in fact the leader of the aliens, and that he was manipulating Data. So you can see that this is actually the story idea that they went with. They scrapped DS9 crossover idea, and instead of making them random aliens, made them the Borg, and decided to do a follow-up to Borg and the consequences of Hugh. And they talked before about how Rick Berman described the Borg as kind of a two-dimensional character, that they're not actually characters, they're a threat. Which I actually agree with to an extent. Yes, funny, I agree with Rick Berman. How about that? But it's known to happen from time to time. But so they thought they didn't really want to do the Borg again because they didn't, which I think is a smart instinct. Now, let's not overuse the Borg, Voyager. Damn it. Let's use them very sparingly. But then I thought, oh, well, it would be worthwhile if we actually did a follow-up to Hugh, which is what I was thinking. Like, I really, as an audience member around this time, I really, really wanted a follow-up to Hugh. I was like, yeah, are they ever going to tell us what happened? And so when I read in the TV guide that we'd be getting a follow-up, I was again so excited that we'd finally be getting a follow-up of what happened to Hugh. So I think that was a good instinct. So they obviously inputted it into the idea that Jerry Taylor had and adjusted it to fit in the Borg and say, let's have it so Lore takes over the Borg, which seems very serendipitous that Lore just so happens to come across these Borg, but whatever. I'm usually willing to go with stuff like that. And at the time, I actually wanted to see Lore again as well because we hadn't seen him since Brothers. But the thing with Lore is I actually, when I was 14 at the time, I liked Lore. I thought he was an interesting villain. Nowadays, he's the evil twin trope, and I freaking hate him, and he's two-dimensional. But here's the thing with Lore, is that in the episode Brothers, he was actually used very well because he didn't come off as two-dimensional evil twin stereotype. At least not entirely. He had some dimension to him. So had they had done that in these episodes, then I think there is a way this could have been good. But unfortunately, they just turned him into a two-dimensional evil twin stereotype and instead made him a cult leader, based him off a cult leader. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, jumping into part 2. Staying with part 1 for a bit. Like, it as I mentioned, this is a good episode. Like, I think there's things about this episode that I still love on the rewatch. Because it's unique in several ways. Because it presents like this existential threat to the Federation, but in a very different way than Best of Both Worlds, which I think is actually very clever. And it has more of that season 6 tone, which is really more of a darker tone than the show was in season 3. And I think that's used to the advantage, and the show comes off as you have that. Best of Both Worlds had that high tension that like you're on edge because oh my god, these impossible to defeat foes are about to destroy the Federation, and you have that same sort of on edge feeling in this episode, but it's got a different tone. It's more darker. It's more of like, it's not like they're coming to assimilate you and their shields are impossible to defeat. And it's like, no, it's these, they're fucking gonna kill you. And it's very dark. Like the away team beams down to an outpost and like everyone's dead and there's dead bodies everywhere. And then they show up and start like, I'm gonna kill you. You killed Croesus. And they start. So it's more threatening. It's more of like a slasher, like horror type thing than like a standard like war. And so yeah, it has that, and also you add in the element to Data feeling anger, and and really exploring the nuance of that and how he has that scene with him and Troy was really good. Like I really liked that scene where apparently he's been watching porn. But anyway, he says, if I'm only capable of feeling anger and malice, would that not make me a bad person? And they slowly play with it, and then you get that scene with Data and Croesus, where Croesus is manipulating Data. That was like really creepy scene. Although, why was that fucking security guard just standing there and letting it happen? He's not paying any attention. Do your fucking job. But anyway, so that was a very creepy scene, and it had this undertone throughout the whole episodes of Data being manipulated at the same time of this Borg threat, where like this outpost like called for help just because they saw a Ferengi ship. Like a really good job of like everyone being on edge, and like Admiral Nechayev came in and assigned it like all these ships and put Picard in charge of a particular task force. So yeah, it had this really like tension filled like feeling that Best of Both Worlds did, but differently, because Best of Both Worlds is actually, to be fair, was more of a greater threat. Like they're coming to just wipe out the Federation, nothing we can do. But this has more of an element of unpredictability, of like what exactly are they trying to do. They're not trying to assimilate us, they just want to kill us all, and just showed up and killed these people at random. So you have this high tension, really expanding thing, and Admiral Nechayev showing up and laying down the law and being like, this is the threat or whatever. Now I gotta talk about her. The scene with Nechayev and Picard where she tells him off for for just returning Hugh instead of using the virus to wipe out the Borg. So basically what Admiral Nechayev is that you should have committed genocide, and next chance you get, you are ordered to commit genocide. That is essentially what she was saying. Now, I had this conversation back in Borg, where apparently some people didn't see it as genocide, and Riker himself tried to make the BS excuses like, oh, there are no innocent civilians among the Borg. But the rest of that episode kind of proved that there were, because they were not that grown children like Hugh sort of implied. Instead, they made it clear that these were actually individuals who were assimilated against their will and forced into this life that they didn't ask for. So, in other words, if you disconnected them from the collective, as we'll definitely see later in Voyager, then they can return to being individuals with every right. So, in other words, there are innocent civilians, people who are being abducted and used against their will. So if you get taken a virus that will wipe them all out, you are committing genocide. And so Admiral Nechayev, she's like the worst. She's not like, there's a cliche about the evil admiral or the bad admiral, or the admiral who's evil. She's not evil, she's just fucking terrible at her job. Now granted, yeah, she's ordering Picard to commit genocide, so it does make her a bit evil, but more along the lines of, yeah, that's just, I remember even when I first saw this episode, that scene where she goes in and says, "You're ordered to protect Federation lives, not to wrestle with your conscience." Like, part of me was like, just shut the fuck up. God damn it. He's such a terrible admiral. And, but, yeah, she's even worse than that. She's like, "I order you to commit genocide." Anyway, like that aside, yeah, so the episode had a really hard tension, and yeah, there's this ever present threat to the Federation. What is Data doing? He's becoming these, negative emotions are twisting him. So it was a really good personal story. And then part 2 comes and it goes, the threat is gone. Instead, you get a goofy storyline with Crusher in charge of the Enterprise. You get just Data and Laura hanging out on the planet, doing their funky experiments, and like Laura putting on Geordi's visor, and there's no threat anymore. That's gone. It's not creepy. Data turns into the evil mustache twirly, "I am not your pet anymore." So instead of it being this dark, twisted, horror-ass story of Data getting his negative emotions sort of twisting him, he's now an evil stereotype cartoon villain caricature. All of a sudden, and they just hang out on the planet and do nothing. Now, let's be a little bit fair to part 2. Part 1 kind of set it up for failure. As much as I did enjoy part 1, and I think it had a really, and in fact, I think in that ways it's actually worse than part 1 of Time Zero, retrospectively. Like, it was more, like with Time Zero, I think it wasn't setting up part 2 for failure. I think there was a way that part 2 could have been equally as good, but the writers just dropped the ball. Where I think with Descent, I think the writers set themselves up to fail. Like, they gave themselves too impossible of a task. And I was reading a lot of quotes from the writers like Jerry Taylor and Brendan Braga and Ronald D. Moore, and they were all pretty much saying that there was too many balls up in the air, and there was too much going on, and there was too much to resolve. So the fact of the matter is that in order to do the story justice, they needed to do more episodes than just one. But doing more than just a 2-parter was outside of the realm of possibility for TNG. Ironic, at the same time that Descent Part 2 was airing, DS9 went and did a 3-parter. But so really they should have made this at the very least 3 parts. I'm thinking of like the season opener of season 7 of DS9, where there was a cliffhanger episode, but then they resolved that cliffhanger in 2 parts. So season 7 opened with the 2-parter that resolved the cliffhanger from the previous season. So that's actually what they should have done here. Because honestly, yeah, there would have been no way to resolve this storyline satisfactory in just 1 episode. Because I agree, because that was the problem with inputting this Data, the Borg and Hugh into the lore Data storyline, is that there was too much going for it. You had to resolve Data being twisted by lore, and the threat of the Borg, and also Hugh and how the Borg now have emotions. Like, you had to resolve it all. And it was too much to do in part 2. Now, the other ways, there's several other ways that the part 1 set up part 2 for failure. The thing with the entire crew beaming down to the planet to search for Data is dumb and doesn't make any sense. And this happened in part 1. And part 2 just had to deal with the fallout of that, because in fact, the first thing they do in part 2 is start beaming everyone back on the Enterprise, and that's the big crisis. Oh no, we have to make sure that we have to get to the planet and find some way to beam all these people back to the Enterprise. Why the fuck did you beam them down in the first place? I mean, I get the leave no man behind, and that Data is very important personally and professionally to the Enterprise crew. But it makes no sense for them to in that scene where Picard says to Geordi is oh yeah, we're gonna beam down everyone to the planet and we'll leave a skeleton crew. But everyone, including me and you, are beaming down to the planet. Why? That doesn't make any sense. Also, just a side note, and in part 1, Geordi kept sitting in Counselor Troy's chair. In fact, there was a battle situation, and Geordi was there, and he was doing his engineering stuff from Troy's tiny little console thing, but really there's an engineering console in the back. And this is the only episode where that ever happened. And then when Picard was having that conversation, it was Geordi was sitting. and so that was weird. My thought is, and this is just my speculation, is that the director wanted to have a simple 2-shot of Picard and Geordi. So if Geordi was back, and Geordi was the only other main character that Picard was interacting with on the bridge. So if he was back on the engineering station, then it would be weird. They could have had Picard walk back there, but then it was a different angle. He wouldn't be looking ahead. So I think the director's let's just put Geordi in that chair, and that way we can do a simple 2-shot. That's what I think that was. But anyway, beaming everyone down to the planet. Yeah, that's... And also, especially the situation that they were in that was described in this episode about, the Borg attacking the Federation, everyone being on edge and people freaking out, and they just wiped out this whole outpost, and worried about this whole other invasion, Borg invasion, that could destroy the Federation. So in a crisis like that, they're going to empty out the Enterprise to search for one officer. I'm sorry, I don't care who that officer is. This is totally unbelievable BS. Would completely not happen. And also, they put Crusher in charge. Now, I'll get to the Crusher being the captain of the Enterprise in a minute. But because I think that's a good idea, but again, it doesn't really make any sense. So if they set up Crusher being in charge of the Enterprise, if part 2 begins and immediately Riker beams back and takes control, then that's kind of a letdown. So I feel like because they put Crusher in charge, that the writers of part 2 felt obligated to actually do something with that. And so, but in a way that doesn't, the way part 2 should have went in my eyes was that it should have been more about the Borg trying to destroy the Federation. I think that was the promise, that the cliffhanger that part 1 made, and it completely let down on that promise, and broke that promise, I should say. And but the thing with Crusher being in charge of the Enterprise, that wouldn't work in a storyline where the Enterprise was actively trying to stop the Borg from destroying the Federation. At least I don't think it would. So they had to do something else. So part 1 really... And also the other thing is, as good as that scene was with Croesus and Data, where Croesus was manipulating Data, the scene at the end where Data shows up and says, "The sons of Soon," he's instantly acting evil. So again, it's portraying this is the beginning of him being a cartoon caricature villain. So I complained about that in part 2, but really part 1 set him up to be like that. So part 1 set it up for failure. It's, as much as I did like part 1 and think it was a better episode than part 2, they didn't do a good job of setting up for part 2. They basically made it almost inevitable that part 2 would suck. Because, not really, but as I said, like, they did these things at the end of the episode that were dumb. And we're setting up dumb storylines. So, which leads us into part 2. So, Laura, at the end of part 1, Laura says, Data says, the sons of Soon have joined together, and together will destroy the Federation. So, part 2 is obviously going to be about them trying to destroy the Federation, right? Wrong! Part 2 is about them hanging out on the planet doing these funky experiments on Geordi. I'm sorry, but nobody gives a shit about that. And here's the thing about part 2, is that it's one of the storylines, I wouldn't say, or the cliches or the tropes, I wouldn't say that I hate it. I would say that I think it's boring and don't really care for them, and they usually don't lead to interesting stories, is our main characters are being held prisoner. And let's make a story out of that. I always hate that. I can't think of any episodes of any shows where I actually find that premise interesting. And that's basically what this episode was. The majority of it was Picard, Troy, and Geordi being in the cell trying to talk sense to Data, and I just find that so boring. Like, we were promised, we were promised to have this best of both worlds type existential threat to the Federation, which is what was making clear in part 1, where the outpost everyone was killed and it was horrific. That's what we were promised, but instead we just got to see Geordi, Picard, and Troy hanging out in the frickin' holding cell. And then Lore, being his two-dimensional mustache twirly fucking villain, being like, oh, let me wear this visor. And then Brent Spiner got to ham it up. So this gets back to what I was saying about Lore, is that they could have done Lore well. Like, they could have found, like, an avenue to explore Lord's character, like maybe he actually did really want to connect with Data, and they could, like, actually, the fact that they were brothers, they could have, like, this connection, rather than it being a simple case of Lord obviously manipulating Data. Like, that one scene when he has, like, the emotions and he, like, takes some away from Data and he's like, I want more, give me more. They play kind of like a drug addiction thing, and Laura's like, okay, a little more. Like, that was so dumb. Like, if they should have played it off in the way where there was a genuine connection between the two, and that Lore wasn't just an evil guy. If he actually did in fact have genuine feelings about Data and wanted to actually have a brotherly, loving relationship with him, but he was, of course, twisted because he wanted to destroy the Federation. And yes, he could be manipulating Data into doing that, but in a more sincere kind of way, a more believable way, a way where Data didn't have to turn into a caricature himself in order to do it. The Data could. All right, I'll give a specific example so you know what I'm talking about. DS9, again, jumping ahead for those of you who haven't seen it, spoilers, but in season 6 of DS9, when Odo is convinced by the female changeling to not help Kira and Ram in their resistance, and because of that the resistance failed and Ram gets arrested, is going to be executed, and Odo's acting like, oh, I don't care, it doesn't really involve me. Like, that was totally believable, even though it really went against Odo's character, because he's been shown to be very compassionate. He cares about Kira, he cares about the Alpha Quadrant, and then he all of a sudden is like, nah, I don't give a shit. You guys do what you do. I'm too busy linking with this other changeling. But you bought it. It made sense. Because of the fact that they didn't turn Odo into a caricature. They didn't say, oh, I'm evil now. Let's destroy the Federation. Instead, they took an avenue about it that, because of his desire to, attachment for home, or to be with his people and to be with the changelings, you could buy that he'd be willing to just become apathetic to everything else and be like, oh, this changeling stuff is all that matters. So if they had done something like that with Data, that him being in this relationship with his brother and having that desire, maybe in the emotions, could bring on this desire, not just using emotions as like a jonesing for them like they're heroin or something, but having it like be like more of a desire for belonging or to have a family. And because of that, he's sort of willing to be a bit apathetic to the Federation. So when Lore's like, oh, we want to destroy the Federation, like, it doesn't sound right to him, but he's kind of willing to let it go because, and maybe, I think it would be better if you had it so Data had no involvement in it, that, or at least directly with Picard and all of them, for him to be like, I'm not your puppet anymore, and all that bullshit is just too unbelievable. It's too outside of his character that it just doesn't work. So there is a way this could have been done correctly. There is a way that they could have made Lore, like, again, if they made him more three-dimensional, more dynamic, they could touch on the fact that he felt abandoned by Soon, and then the Enterprise tried to kill him, and so he's resentful for them for that, but he actually does care about the Borg. He does care about Data. Like, turning him into a cult leader, I think, was the wrong way to go. And it comes off as cliche. And I talked about this before, how I never really like episodes on any show, because there's been a lot on several different shows about cults. I don't know, it just, maybe for me personally, has never been a subject I've been particularly interested in. I mean, that being said, I love The Leftovers, and that's very much about cults, but it's still something I really enjoy the way that they do that, because it didn't feel like your standard cliche cult stuff, which is a lot of these episodes on a lot of these sci-fi shows like Star Trek, Stargate, and whatever, tend to be just like your cliche standard, oh, here's a cult. And, of course, DS9 has an infamous one in season 7. But yeah, so the writers specifically said that they modeled Lore off of David Koresh, who was a cult leader in the early 90s, for those who don't know or remember. And I get that, and it's just like, I don't know, it felt half-assed. Like, it wasn't fully developed. Like, the scene we get with Lore talking to that random Borg who disconnected himself, it's like, I need you to build this. He was obviously trying to make him like this cult leader type, and I don't think that was the right way to go. I think they're just turning him into a caricature, a two-dimensional villain by doing that. They shouldn't have done that. They should have made it more about Lore, his legitimate grievances with Starfleet, and his legitimate desire to be a better person and to have a family. So if they could still, I'm not saying they should have made him good. He still could have been a villain, but make him a more believable, more three-dimensional villain, and not just the evil twin stereotype, which unfortunately is what they decided to do. So, yeah, so they ruined it. So there's definitely a way that they could have been done. Now, Hugh was also very misused. He barely appears in the episode, first of all. I mean, at least they had him, I will say. But he interacts almost exclusively with Worf and Riker. If you would have picked, out of the 7 main characters of The Next Generation, you look back to Borg, if you would pick the 2 characters that Hugh interacted with the least in the episode of Borg, it would be Worf and Riker. To my recollection, he had no interaction with Riker whatsoever. I don't think he even met him unless it happened off screen, and Worf was just standing in the background as a security guard, just being your standard jail keeper. He had the most interactions with Geordi, obviously, and they played lip service to that, but that's all they did. Crusher would be next. I don't know if he had that much interaction with Data. Like, maybe a little bit. More than Worf and Riker. And, yeah, I don't know if he had that much interaction with Troy either. A little bit with Picard, particularly towards the end when they met him and did all that stuff. So it's mainly Geordi, Crusher, Picard, and Guinan. Those were the main characters that Hugh interacted with. And, of course, Guinan, not in this episode. She doesn't appear in the show anymore at this stage, unfortunately. But so you just left with Crusher, who is on the ship, being the commander of the ship, so not involved in the storyline. And Geordi and Picard, who are being held prisoner. And so they have no interaction with Hugh. In fact, the problem, and this is exactly what I mean by the story was trying too many things, because they wanted to emphasize the friendship with Geordi and Data, and how Data is losing himself by directly endangering and torturing his best friend, which, again, I think was a mistake because it's unbelievable. You don't buy, no matter how brainwashed he is, that he would do this. For one, like, again, Odo, it would have been like in an episode of DS9 if Odo was like torturing Kira and getting ready to kill her. You would never buy that. Never in a billion years. But if you made it so he was simply apathetic to Rom being executed, you 100% buy that. So they were too busy making this whole thing with Geordi and Data. And so Geordi couldn't meet with Hugh at all. They didn't even have him talk to Hugh at the end of the episode because he, of course, had to be taken to sickbay right away. So you got no interactions between Geordi and Hugh. And that was the whole, purpose. There was the whole core of Borg. The whole meaning of Hugh's character is that he had made this attachment to Geordi, who just says, "Oh, tell me about Geordi," and that's all that we get. That's bullshit. If you can't do Hugh properly, then don't fucking do him at all. If you can't rearrange, if you want to spend too much time having this bullshit with Data and Geordi, then you're kind of sabotaging yourself because you can't have a friendship with Hugh and Geordi. And then Hugh, at the end, saves Data. He goes out of his way and goes, "No!" and jumps up and stops Laura from killing Data. As I mentioned, barely had any interactions with Data. I would have bought it more if it was Picard, to be honest. And if it was Geordi, 100%. But by making... And then having, Riker and Worf interacting. Well, what kind of bullshit is that? And then at the end, they're like, "Oh, you're going to be the leader." He never came off as a leader type. I don't know. The whole thing just felt very weak. And it's funny because after part 2 aired, I remember reading articles, interview with Rick Berman. He said, "Oh, yes, we'll be following up on this again. You will see the follow-up of what became of Hugh later on this season." Spoilers, we do not. We don't see this. Now, Hugh does appear many decades later in Star Trek Picard, But they don't really even mention what happens here. They kind of pay lip service to it, if I remember correctly. They basically, you became free of the Borg. That's the extent that they mention this episode. So we don't get a follow-up to it. And plus, they needlessly kill that character off for no good reason, but that's a Picard thing. Now, as far as Dr. Crusher and her storyline being in command of the Enterprise, as much as I think they shouldn't have done that, I think this was easily my favorite storyline of Part 2. This is the only storyline that really worked for me. In fact, I kept wanting them to go back to this. Whenever they went back to that boring-ass prison cell of Picard and Troy being like, oh, Data's upset, he's evil now. I'm like, please go away from this. Get me back to the Enterprise. So this, I actually did like this scene, or these scenes, this storyline. With Ensign Tate, who's an interesting character. It's a good, lower decker. Maybe, I think I heard somewhere this is partly the inspiration for the episode of Lower Decks. I don't know, they should have brought this character back. I don't know why they didn't. But it was interesting because Crusher is supposed to be, the doctor's in command of the ship, isn't it weird? But she doesn't really do anything abnormal. She just, I think there's this undercurrent of the fact that she is not an experienced command officer, but that's about it. So she's relying more on the staff, but they're also not the main characters, so they're also not super experienced. And we do get Lieutenant What's-His-Face, I can't even remember his name, who's supposed to be slightly more experienced. And so the interactions between Tate, him, and Crusher were actually quite good. And I like that that's sort of back and forth. And when then I have to make sure my calculations are accurate, Ensign. And then she throws that back in his face later on. That was kind of good. So I do love the interactions between these three characters, and it's also interesting to note that the actor who plays Lieutenant What's-His-Face is the same actor who played Joe Brill in Suspicions, which is funny because they actually make a reference to Suspicions because Dr. Crusher uses the metaphysic shielding to go into the sun to hide from the Borg. And I do like the callback. There's a lot of continuity, and it makes sense that because Crusher was heavily involved in that experiment, that she would bring it up here. So that's a good use of Crusher's character, making it personal for her. So that's all good. But my main problem with this storyline is that the Borg ship is not all that threatening. This compared to the Borg cube in Best of Both Worlds, it would have destroyed the Enterprise by now. There's several times where the Borg ship fired on the Enterprise and nothing really happened. It was just like, poof. No, it should have been more threatening. And it was too easy to destroy it. All it had to do is do a solar flare. And I think this is the same trick that Kern used in Redemption Part 2. You just think of it like the Borg cube from Best of Both Worlds. It would just reflect off its shields and it would do nothing to it. But the problem is they set up a situation where it was the Enterprise versus the giant Borg ships. So the only way to handle that is to make it less threatening, is to make it more vulnerable and less invincible. And so ultimately, you could make in the universe headcanon of that these Borg aren't as efficient as the actual Borg collective, and so their ship's not going to be as good, whatever. But that really, it deflates all that tension I was talking about, all the high stakes, all the suspense that was in Part 1, just deflates all of that by making it just this dinky little ship that's so easy to destroy. By the way, they didn't make it very clear like, that this was just a group outside of the collective. You know, I think it was implied in part one. A lot of people assumed that this was the entire collective because that's what they were saying in Borg. They didn't say, "Oh, we're gonna spread individuality to one ship." No, they were saying they were gonna spread individuality to the collective. And so that's what you had to assume until there was a throwaway line at the end of the episode where Hugh says, "Oh, maybe one day we'll rejoin the collective." So, okay, so now you're saying there is a collective and there's only this one ship that was affected by it. And where did they get the materials to build that weird, funky ship anyway with all the dimensions? And I don't know. Anyway, this was the first introduction of the Borg using what's that technology, the subspace corridor thing? Transwarp drive. Is it transwarp drive? Transwarp corridors or something like that? Subspace, I don't know, whatever the hell they call it. In Voyager, the Borg will use this all the time, very commonly. And I remember when I first saw that in Voyager, I was like, but is that Borg technology? Because I thought that was just these rogue Borgs. I didn't know that the actual Borg had it, because we didn't see the actual Borg use it because it wasn't introduced until this episode, where it was that funky, weird looking Borg ship, the rogue Borg, that used it. But I suppose they're saying in retrospect that these rogue Borg got it from the actual Borg. And so that was the actual Borg technology that they were using. But anyway, yeah, so whatever on that account. So, yeah, that's basically it. The part two was just a massive disappointment, and they could have done like something really threatening, existential threat to the Federation. Like this, what I imagine would happen is that like Lore and the Borg would like take Picard and Geordi like prisoner on their ship as they went to the Federation. They started attacking the Federation. We had all these other ships like swarming around them, and they would do no good. And then maybe Crusher would be behind on the Enterprise, and they would try to come up with some wacky solution. And then maybe we'd have some characters still on the planet, like Riker and freaking Hugh. I don't know. I'm just spitballing. I'm not a professional writer. The people who were professional writers should have done a fucking better job than the bullshit we got in this episode. But anyway, something along those lines would have been way better than what we got. But anywho, so I would now like to thank everyone for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with the channel. It does inspire me to keep going. So thank you all so much for your support. I want to give a big special thanks to Antarius and Brandon Neil House. Thank you both so very much for your strong support. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Benjamin Mead, Greg Marley, Francisco Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Miguelcio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we do have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "Descent, more like P-cent." You know, everyone hates this episode. I actually like it. I'm a big Data fan, so seeing more of his story is nice. And I know it's shoehorned and stupid, but when Lore says, "I love you," at the end, it really gets to me, since I have a brother who is a handful sometimes, but has a good heart. I enjoy this episode, and it makes me feel things, and it smells like pee, apparently. So, I get what you're saying about that ending, because I would find it kind of, part of me does find it a little, heartbreaking how he says, I love you, brother, and then dies. And then the way Data says, goodbye, Lore. Like, that is kind of sad. But the thing is, if they had done the episode, like I said, and earned that and made it be more about Lore, like, genuinely wanting to reconnect with his brother, then that scene would have been a billion times more powerful. It actually would have worked. Whereas where they just made Lore a manipulative asshole who just was like this cult leader type who's using Data to get what he wants, less effective that way. My opinion. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, like Time's Arrow, this is a clear case that I really like the first part, but I hate the second part. What they did was horrible and so contrived. Data would never ever betray his friends, and especially be willing to torture his best friend Geordi. Having emotions should make him hate Lore and to even kill him, not to join him and his cause. Also, I have to address that when Data was practicing to trying to be angry again in the holodeck, I've just noticed that to turn off the safeties and even increase the strength of the Borg, Data needed another senior staff member to unlock it. I bring this up because I'm currently binge watching Voyager before you get to it so that I can be more familiar, and when I write comments for it, I will watch those episodes again, for it's been about 6 years since I've seen Voyager in its entirety. But anyway, I'm currently in season 5 and just watched the episode Extreme Risk, where B'Elanna was acting suicidal and doing those daredevil stunts in the holodeck, and she switched off the safeties without the authorization of another staff member, and the computer didn't even mention that, like in this episode. So this is totally inconsistent. But to be fair, it's more to do with Voyager episode than this episode. I just wanted to mention that. But to sum up, the worst Borg in TNG, and even the worst Lore episode as well. He is two-dimensional, and his defeat wasn't so satisfying to me. So my rating is a 7 for the first episode and a 2 for the second episode. So overall, a 4 out of 10. Yeah, I mean, it does make more sense the way they did in this episode, where they needed 2 officers to override the safeties. But several things about that. First thing is that the safeties never work when they're supposed to anyway. So, and that part, it seems ridiculous. You need 2 people to turn off a system that breaks down all the time by itself. And the other thing is that in this episode, there was basically plot contrivance. They just made up that thing of having 2 officers so they could have this argument between Geordi and Data, and Geordi being like, oh, you're risking your life over this experiment. They wouldn't be able to do that if they didn't need 2 officers. So that was I think that was contrived in order to have it. But I will say it does make a lot more sense. Now, as far as... Alright, so here's the thing with Data. When I said that Lore turned off his ethical program, and so he became evil and started hurting Geordi, yeah, that's dumb. It would have made more sense if he just attacked Lore. And I often make this comparison to the Voyager episode Equinox Part 2, where we get a version of this, and in my opinion, a much worse case, where they just turn the Doctor's ethical program off, and then he starts torturing 7 of 9 and being all evil and supporting Captain Ransom. Now, I buy it, even though I think the 2 are quite terrible. Like, the Data stuff is dumb, as I talked about, and it doesn't fit his character, and I don't buy it. But I would say it's not quite as bad as the Equinox example, because at least in this case they make a point with that scene with Croesus, and then later on with Lore, that Lore is manipulating Data through emotions. That is, using emotions as kind of a sort of a drug or whatever to sort of manipulate Data into doing what he wants. Well, you do what I want, otherwise I'll take these emotions away from you. They made it maybe a little too clear. Now, as I said, I don't think that explains why Data turned completely evil, but it does give him an extra incentive to do so, whereas in the Equinox, they didn't explain it at all. The only thing that they did is turn off the Doctor's moral program, and he instantly, all of a sudden, went from being 709's friend and supporting the Voyager crew to all of a sudden supporting Ransom, who he had no connection to whatsoever. Where really it would have made a lot more sense that as soon as they turned off the ethical program, that the Doctor would just fucking kill Ransom. Like, him teaming up and then torturing his best friend made no sense whatsoever. Whereas, as I said, it doesn't really make all that much sense with Data, but at least they had that extra incentive of the emotions. So, in my opinion, it's not quite as bad. Like, the Equinox version, I think, is actually much worse. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who said, I really enjoyed the first part of Descent. Did the security officer in the brig not hear Data and Croesus talking? Maybe he was on his lunch break or listening to music on his earphones. Stephen Hawkins makes an appearance in the first part. A 4-person away team consisting of Picard, Geordi, Troy, and some random red shirt who commits suicide by trying to shoot while there are about 50 Borg in front of him. Maybe he thought he was a main character and wouldn't die. Beverly Crusher is captain of the Enterprise, and I like these scenes. James Horan, second appearance in the Trek franchise. I always recognized him because of his distinctive voice. Jonathan Del Arco reprises his role as Hugh. My rating for part 1 is 8. If Croesus was Lore's right-hand Borg, why was he sacrificed as a decoy so that the Borg ship can get away? Out of 10. Part 2 is a weak 6. They overdid Data's emotions and generations. Out of 10. So I wouldn't say that they didn't sacrifice Croesus. I saw it as more of they purposely planted him on the Enterprise so that he could manipulate Data. I don't know how they knew he wouldn't die. Maybe he had like extra shielding that would protect him. But you notice, like in that scene where he beams aboard, like the 2 Borg beam aboard the bridge. One of them like attacks the crew and is instantly killed. But Croesus is just standing there. Like he just stands there and does nothing. So I think he intentionally wanted to get shot. He was just like waiting to be shot. He's like, come on, shoot me. So he could be, and as I said, he probably had this extra shielding to ensure he wouldn't die. And then he was purposely wanted to be brought to the brig so that he could manipulate Data. That's how I saw it. That's what makes sense to me anyway. Now the emotion chip is a good thing. I forgot to mention that because that was created in Brothers and Lore stole it, and I love how they at least kept that continuity and that he was using that emotion chip to manipulate Data, and then they took it from him and Data was going to destroy it, but Geordi's like, I can't let you do that. And then in Generations they randomly, hey, let's actually put this in after all. But yeah, that storyline was kind of botched, but that is something that I have already covered because I've already covered Generations. Yeah, so anyway, oh yeah, the whole thing with the security guard on his lunch break. No, he wasn't on his lunch break, but he was listening to music on his earphones. That's definitely what was happening. They should have showed him in the background being like, anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, Oh man, part 1 was actually compelling with an exploration of AI possibly turning dangerous and much more complex and cerebral than Voyager's Darkling or the android command virus from the secretive Romulan operations in Picard. Admiral Nechaev's scene with Picard was especially compelling and unfortunately was never followed up on again. Then came the revelation, which I guess was supposed to shock us, similarly as when Denise Crosby came out of the shadows in Redemption Part 1, only this time it's Lore. Oh boy. Lore has taken over the independent Borg contingent and wants to be in league with Data to take over the living life forms. A bit disappointing though, possibly compelling for cliffhanger, and then what the fuck? Data is controlled remotely via emotion drugs via Lore. Lore is predictably cartoonishly evil. Data is tested to damage Geordi, later to be copied with an even less reason with the Doctor in 709 in Equinox Part 2. We do see Hugh, but he never sees his friend Geordi and instead deals with Worf and Riker because reasons. The only part I liked in Part 2, even though the setup for how Crusher gets command in the emergency scenario is preposterous, I did enjoy seeing Crusher in command and believing in her bright ensign, unlike the prick who tries to underestimate her and is also a copy of the Data and Prick story in Redemption Part 2. Hey, one can even argue that the lore reveal at the end of the episode is as promising as the Sela reveal at the end of Redemption Part 1. But I admit I did like seeing Crusher in action, but that was probably the only part I liked of an otherwise disastrous Part 2. Oh, and like Unimatrix Zero, we never hear about this independent Borg contingent again, except Hugh somehow became a Federation citizen and is one of the leaders of the Romulans' reclamation project, I guess. 3.5 emotional chips out of 10. I don't think that the asshole lieutenant was quite as... He's not nearly as bad as the asshole commander in Redemption Part 2. The Mr. Bigot, I think is calm. I don't think I'd be a good first officer for you. This guy wasn't nearly as bad as that. I actually didn't really have a problem with him. I thought he was kind of believable. He didn't outright say you're just an ensign, shut up. He would just be like, when she said something, it's like, I just have to make sure my calculations are correct, ensign. That's the only thing, and that's not that bad. So I actually kind of liked him, honestly. But anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, the opening scene on the holodeck is really great, but in my opinion, Data is reacting rather slow to the red alert. The biggest problem with the episode is that it neither fits to what we already know about the Borg, nor what we see in the future. It's totally unbelievable that the Borg, who assimilated individuals all the time, are so affected by the reintegration of Hugh into the collective. Nevertheless, the principal ideas of following up on Hugh episode, as well as further exploring Data's humanity, were good, but the execution was mostly bad. Did the security guard leave the room when Data was talking to the Borg, or why didn't he report this conversation to a superior? In my opinion, the way Data's behavior is altered by simply deactivate one of his subroutines is not only too easy, but also character assassination. Instead of showing that Data is more complex than the sum of his parts, he is a bunch of programs and easy to manipulate. in my headcanon, I totally ignore this episode because it is so much interferes with my picture of Data. My rating is a 3 out of 10. So the security guard, you could actually see him in the background of the scenes with Croesus manipulating the Data. So I actually like Stephen Kennedy's theory that he was listening to his headphones. But anyway, so it's not just that they disabled his subroutine. They also was lore manipulating him with the lore. Sorry. Lore was manipulating Data with the lore of emotions. And I still agree with you, though. I still think that's not good enough. And I still think I agree with what you're saying about Data, that it portrays them as too easy to manipulate and too easy to be reprogrammed, which is also my problem with the episode Brothers when he took over the ship. It does make him a bit too much of a security risk, and it makes him seem more like it's just a dumb robot, which is what I've always been a big proponent of, that he's simply more than a robot, and he's always at his most interesting when he is. And this is actually really, I agree, it's character assassination. I think that is definitely a good way to put it. Anyway, another comment from Stephen Kennedy, who says, when there's an episode that has 2 parts, have the same person write both episodes. That should be writing 101. Adjusted comment, Deep Space Nine and Voyager did the same thing. It seemed to work for Deep Space Nine. I guess Ira Steven Behr made sure part 2 is sort of made sense. Yeah, no, I actually think it's common practice to have different writers write part 1 and 2. But what you have to remember, again, this is something I have to re-emphasize, because even though, because of SAG rules and whatnot, or union rules, whatever the union the writers are, SAG is actors, I think, but whatever, the WGA, whatever it's called, because of union rules, they can only have credited so many people, and usually the one who is credited as the writer went and wrote the script. Although that's also screenplay. Teleplay is when you actually just write the actual teleplay and you don't come off with the idea. So written by usually implies more ownership to the script. But regardless, every episode is written by the staff, or at least bandied back by the staff. Like, not all of them, like some, like Yesterday's Enterprise, is generally like everyone goes and write a different scene and they come back together and throw it back together. Not every episode is written like that, but every episode is bandied back and forth by the whole staff before the writer goes off and write it. So in other words, the writer is given an outline of everything that the whole group came up with together, and then the writer goes off and write it. So in that case, I think having different writers write it doesn't really make any difference, because you still have the same core group who breaks down both episodes. So in that way, I think it's fine. That's not why this episode sucked. And by the way, Rene Echevarria, I talked about him a lot, how he's one of my favorite writers. He unfortunately wrote this episode. And, again, I blame the whole writing staff for this. But anyway, next comment is from Brandon Neal Howells, who says, Data on the holodeck with Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, and Stephen Hawking is gold, and I like Crusher in command of the Enterprise. I'm really sorry that we never see Ensign Tate after this episode. She had great potential. Brent Spiner annoys me when he's playing Data's relatives. I don't understand or care how or why lore gives the Borg names, individuality, and a plan to destroy the Federation. How? This episode was titled Descent, because the Enterprise was supposed to crash, which might have made the episode slightly more interesting, but I doubt it. 4 lazy security guards out of 10. I didn't hear about the Enterprise was supposed to crash. I always thought descent was more of a metaphorical, like the descent that the Data takes into becoming a madman, or the descent that the Borg had taken. Lore didn't give them individuality. They got the individuality by Hugh. Lore makes that very clear. He's like, I didn't do that. You did that. He said that to Picard. So, but I think it is implied he did give them names. But that I don't really have an issue with that. But I totally agree about Ensign Tate. Originally that was supposed to be Barclay, but Dwight Schultz was unavailable, and so they made up another character. I'm glad that they did, actually. Again, I'm not a Barclay hater, but I don't love him either, and I think they would have been a bit tired if Barclay was the one on the bridge. Well, actually, no, that might have worked, but I like Ensign Tate better, and I agree they should have brought him. But why didn't you bring him back for Lower Decks, at least? Maybe the actress wasn't available. Anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So, my rating for Descent out of 10 is going to be a 4 poor. I was kind of torn between where I would land with this episode. I think I might give part 1 an 8. And I think I would give part 2 a 3. So really, if I wanted to split the difference, I would give it a 6. But I'm actually not going to split the difference, because even though I would give part 1 an 8, it did set part 2 up for failure. And so when you look back at the two-parter as a whole, it ultimately doesn't work. And here's the thing, like, there's elements of part 1 that I love, like the whole tension, suspense of a Borg attack, and then the Cheoff scene where she's telling Picard to commit genocide. He's ordering Picard to commit genocide. And the stuff with Data slowly, like, being twisted and manipulated with emotions. But the thing is once you learn of what comes of that and the origins of that, that's explained in part 2, that makes part 1 worse. I think, not simply being the conclusion, but I think overall, like in the same way that Game of Thrones season 8 makes the whole show worse, even the really good seasons, I think part 2 makes part 1 worse. So, I would bring the whole kit and caboodle down to a 4 because of this. And I think of when I watch this episode, part 1 in particular, like, oh, these so things I miss, I like. How come I don't watch this episode more? And then I realize why. It's because part 2 makes it worse. Part 2 is so bad that it makes it worse. And they could have, and it's also a missed opportunity, because they could have done something really good with Data and Lore. If they made them 3-dimensional, they could have done something really good with the Borg and Hugh. But honestly, I think they set themselves up for failure by having way too many balls in the air, way too many storylines, that they needed to have at least 2 or 3 episodes to resolve it, not just 1. And there was no way they could have done it satisfactory in 1. So, unfortunately, I do see the episode overall, or the two-parter overall, as a failure. So anyway, that is it for my review of Descend Parts 1 and 2. If you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, leave a comment in the comment section what you think of this episode. It'd be very much appreciated. Just help me out a bit with the algorithm. But if you would really enjoy this video and you really want to support the channel, you can check me out on Patreon. There'll be a link to the description below. There's different tiers with different rewards, such as pre-releases, and you can request a video for me to do and make comments on the episodes that I read in the episodes and stuff like that. So if you check me out on Patreon, very much appreciated, of course. But then, you know, I know not everyone can afford it, so just leaving a like, subscribing, stuff like that, also very helpful as well. So let's see what's coming up next on my channel. Sorry, trying to find the schedule. Where are we? So Monday I'll be ranking all of the episodes of Star Trek Next Generation Season 6 from my least favorite to my favorite. Wednesday I'll be ranking all the episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 1 from my least favorite to my favorite. Thursday I'll be releasing Hugh Revisited. That was another perk on Patreon. I forgot to mention I have a series of Patreon exclusive videos where I revisit older reviews that I've done in the past. This is one I released on Patreon about a year ago. I will be releasing this public as a patron preview, so it'll be public for everyone to see for Q-Who, an episode I think is highly overrated, and I get into a lot more detail in that video about that. So that's coming out Thursday, and then on Saturday will be my review for the Next Generation episode Liaison, starting full force into Season 7. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.